Welcome back to React Native Radio Podcast. Brought to you by Windows 11. Our new taskbar is completely original and not based on anything. Episode 237, React Native on Desktop.
Hey, Mazen, did you catch Reactathon in the park yesterday?
I listened to a couple talks. The most important one that I was really focused on were Gant and Jamon's talk about React Native.
Yes. Gant and Jamon did a really great talk at Reactathon yesterday about the future of React Native, aka React Native Synergy.
What?
Funny story, I actually dared Gant to call it that on stage. And he did, sort of.
He did. He called it out. It was, when I heard it, I was like, whoa.
He called it out, but he, in the context of it being a ridiculous name.
Yeah.
So he said some ridiculous name like React Native Synergy. So I was like, well, technically, he fulfilled his end of the dare.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's going to be the official name.
We'll find out.
Sad to say. But yeah, Reactathon in the park, that was cool. It was I think one of the first in-person conferences since the pandemic.
Yeah.
They decided to go for an outdoor venue.
I thought that was cool. Great location, great venue. And there were a lot of good talks too. Just kind of a lot of good people were there. And
yeah, definitely.
Some of the talks I listened to were very helpful, and especially in regards to React 18 also coming out.
Yep. Great keynote by Kent C. Dodds. A lot of familiar faces. So I think we're excited to get back to in-person conferences pretty soon. I'm sure Jamon will have lots to tell about that whole experience when he gets back. But obviously he's not here for that reason, because he's in the Bay Area for that. So it's just me and Mazen today. Of course, I'm Robin. I'm a senior software engineer here at Infinite Red. I live just west of Portland, Oregon, with my husband and my two little kiddos. Of course, I'm joined by my synergistic co-host,
See what
Mazen.
you did there?
Mazen lives in Durham, North Carolina with his wife and his not-so-newborn son.
No.
How old's your son now?
9 weeks today.
9 weeks? Yeah, so he's getting out of the newborn phase. Mazen is also a senior React Native engineer here at Infinite Red. Of course, I should mention that this episode is sponsored by Infinite Red. Infinite Red is a premier React Native design and development agency located fully remote in the US and Canada. So if you're looking for React Native expertise for your next React Native project, hit us up. You can learn more at our website, infinite.red/React Native. And of course, don't forget to mention that you heard about us through React Native Radio. Also, imagine working with Mazen and myself and the rest of the amazing team here. Who wouldn't want to? If you're a senior level React Native engineer in the US or Canada, go to careers.infinite.red. We'd love to hear from you. All right, let's get into our topic for today, which is React Native on desktop.
This is a cool topic. I'm excited about this one.
Yeah. If you didn't know, React Native is not just iOS and Android. You probably did know that because we've talked a lot about React Native Web, React Native being also for web. But there are also many other, they're called out-of-tree platforms. I don't know where that phrase came from. That's just what the React Native docs call them. Out-of-tree platforms, which are maintained by other organizations besides React Native Core.
We've also called them all platforms, React Native all platforms on the podcast in the past. So stuff like tvOS, also iOS, Android, macOS, Windows. And I believe you could also develop on gaming consoles, so like Xbox.
Oh, yeah. There's also, you could make mini programs for the WeChat platform. WeChat is really huge in China, and they have sort of integrated mini apps, kind of like iMessage apps, I think. But there's a React Native platform for that.
Just as a side note too, I know I mentioned tvOS. You could also develop on Android TV. I know they're considered two different types of platforms, similar to how we have Android and iOS. It's the same on TV devices, but pretty much the same thing when you're building React Native.
Fun fact, we literally just got an Apple TV like 2 days ago in my household. It is amazing. I can't believe I waited until now to get one.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll have to try building some tvOS app.
I will preface this talk with, I have done a tvOS app in the past. And now that we'll get into what aspect of the Mac OS or Windows I did, tvOS was much easier to work with.
Interesting. Yeah. What's the development cycle like? How does that work?
It's very similar to what we're about to get into, where there's like a third-party package done by Doug Lauder that pretty much does the same thing that the React Native Windows and React Native Mac OS do, where similar to React Native Web. Same way that works, that kind of functions in the same aspect. Let's get into our topic a little bit deeper because it'll be very similar, but some of the issues we ran into, I doubt you'll run into when it comes to tvOS. Again, tvOS is also still in development because it's brand new and there's not a lot of need or support for it as much as iOS or Android.
So specifically, as Mazen alluded, we're talking about desktop today. So Mac OS and Windows, which I would argue are probably two of the most prominent of the out-of-tree platforms after iOS, Android, web. So both of us actually went through the process of initializing and running a Mac OS app and a Windows app. Mazen did Mac, I did Windows. So we're just going to talk about what that was like, what the challenges were, and sort of in general, what you might expect if you're going to try and build a desktop app using React Native. So Mazen, why don't you talk about how the Mac OS one went?
Yeah, so it was a little bit interesting because, we're on a React Native 68 going to 69 soon. And this is a third-party library that's linking in to React Native. For Mac OS, though, it was using a much older version. And I say much now, considering it's not too far away. But React Native 64 was the version that I had to use. So I pretty much initted a React Native project with the template of React Native 64. Once all that was done, I went into my package and there's a command you run, npx React Native Mac OS init. It's hyphens in between. Once that was done, there was a Mac OS folder, similar to iOS and Android folders that you get. And at that point, the next command was to run the app. So npx React Native run Mac OS, and the similar boilerplate React Native app that you get came up, but it was like in this little mini screen, which I assume you can resize.
So it's basically a simulator. Is it? I guess it doesn't have to be a simulator because it's like you're on Mac OS, so you're just
Correct.
running the app.
Yeah. In my Docker at the bottom, just this app started bouncing when I ran it.
Whoa.
And that was it. I had a little app. I'm sure if I changed the icon would show up there and all that. Getting it to run, I also tried to go a step further by trying to run it via Xcode because sometimes when you open up Xcode, things could go crazy.
Mm-hmm.
It ran, no issues. Now, I did have to change at the top. You select your device. I had to change it to be my Mac, and it ran just fine. Same way as before. I had iOS, Android, Mac all open at the same time. I changed some text on the screen and live reload, and I got to see it change right there on the screen. The next thing I tried to do, and I think this is where things got crazy for me, I tried to add in navigation. And I was thinking okay, in a Mac app, you don't necessarily navigate like you do on an iOS app, right? You don't click and then it slides in or out. It's more of a drawer that's always on the left or right or at the top sometimes. The one that always came to my mind was Slab, actually came to mind when I was looking at it because that's the latest Mac app.
Slab have a desktop
They
app?
do.
What?
Yeah.
Whoa, hang on.
It's pretty cool. Pretty slick.
Pause for a second. I'm going to have to go download that. I didn't know that existed.
Yeah.
That's game changing. Yeah. Cool. I'm going to have to get that.
Yeah. So I compared Slab, Slack, and Spotify, the 3 S's. And
the 3 most important S's.
And they all had the drawer navigation look. So it's okay, this should be straightforward. React Navigation is a Mac OS supported library.
Famous last words. This should be straightforward.
Right. After installing everything, it took a long time and started eating into my lunchtime, and the baby woke up and it was too much. I think the main issue was because it's React Native version 64, I had to play with the package.json and install the different React. I think I went down to like React Navigation 0.59, I think. I don't know if that's right. But then gesture handler, reanimated, safe area context. I had to start playing, like going down in the versions. And I couldn't get that running, essentially. The odd part is, if you were just Google React Native macOS example, there are none. There are a lot of Windows examples, but not macOS examples. Now, I don't have a Windows machine to try it out, which is why enter Robin.
So one thing that is probably relevant to note is that both React Native Windows and React Native macOS are maintained by Microsoft. Mm-hmm. And you can guess which one of those Microsoft is probably putting more effort into.
Linux?
Microsoft, famously, the creator of Windows, is probably putting more effort into React Native Windows. But I did find it quite funny that Microsoft is also the maintainer of React Native macOS. Mm-hmm. And I'm guessing probably a lot of the Microsoft developers are probably using MacBooks, if I had to gander, I guess.
That'd be funny. I mean, you do. I think one thing we ran into, which is why we did this split, is you do need a Mac for the Mac OS and you do need Windows for the Windows. So I don't know if you can do like a parallels if you're on a Windows and have a Mac OS running. Can you?
I have no idea. That would be pretty wild if you could do that. But I definitely went the route of running it on a Windows machine. And as a result, I didn't get nearly as far as you did. I didn't actually get into trying to install any libraries because it took me a while just to get the machine running. And I had to learn like what PowerShell is. Yeah. Like, I was like, wait a minute, I don't know where anything is. There's no terminal.
Is PowerShell the terminal version for Windows?
Yeah. So what I learned is Windows it used to be called Command Prompt, mm-hmm. and now PowerShell has kind of replaced Command Prompt as the default console application. And then I actually was using a recommended program called Commander, spelled CMDR, which is meant to be sort of a terminal emulator. So it runs more like Unix type commands, if that's what you're familiar with. So that's what I was using. But I had to use PowerShell for a couple of things to like install dependencies. So that was fun to navigate. There is a script that runs. It takes quite a while, but it like checks everything that you need and installs it. I had to install Visual Studio manually and do some manual configurations to get that to run.
That's odd because that's also a Microsoft product, right? And there's extra configuration on a Windows.
Well, yeah, I just had to set it up for like Node and a couple other things.
I guess the asterisk here is I did all this on a MacBook Pro that I already use for React Native development. So I had all this already set up. I think, yes, like what you were mentioning, if I was coming into a clean MacBook or one, I grabbed my wife's MacBook or something, I'd have to install Node and all that kind of stuff too, also.
If you have already been building Android apps using a Windows machine, your environment will already be a lot of the way there. There are additional dependencies though, because of the type of app that you're building. Because like a Windows app, the target app is called a Universal Windows Platform app. And it's either C++ or C#. And so you have to have tooling around that in order to run the sort of the native target app. So that's a lot of what I was installing, but I did get it running. Mm-hmm. I did get it running eventually. But then beyond that, I didn't do much beyond changing the text and like seeing it live reload.
2 points there.
It was cool.
You mentioned C++, and that makes me think like the new architecture is coming out in C++. So I assume once it's maybe React Native 69, we're looking at a much easier way to build Windows apps, and then essentially because it's C++, Mac OS apps could essentially be easier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, possibly. I know you can choose to use C# instead of C++. And there are a couple of reasons why you would pick one or the other. I think performance is definitely one because C++ is a intermediate level language and C# is a high level language. So there's a bit of a performance hit for using C#, but I think it's a better developer experience. And it also just matters what else you're using in the sort of Windows toolchain ecosystem. But you can choose one or the other when you're initializing your app.
So for me, it took me about, I would say, 5-ish minutes to get from starting my init React Native app to React Native, so npx React Native run macOS, and then getting the app bouncing on my Docker and then me seeing it right there. How long did it take you to do all that?
So when I ran the initialize command, I got errors for a while because my dependencies weren't right. So I had to go through the process of fixing that. And I would fix something and then run it again, and fix something and run it again. So that took a little while. But once my environment was fixed, when I ran, I initialized it and that took maybe a couple minutes. And then I run Windows. Mm-hmm. That command alone, the first time I ran it, took about 5 minutes. So it had a very long build time.
And that was the one that eventually the outcome
the outcome was an app popped up with the welcome to React Native.
And you also had a Windows folder in your project, right? Similar to
Correct.
Android, iOS.
Right. I had an Android folder, an iOS folder, and a Windows folder. And the Windows folder was full of C++ files, which is the default.
That's cool.
But then the JavaScript is identical to building iOS and Android apps, which is that's the whole point. Yeah. That's the philosophy of React Native, right? Write once, run anywhere.
And it almost seems like if you are building a one-page app, I guess, so a calculator, let's say, or maybe even a to-do list, but it's a one-page to-do list app, you could build it once and it's available iOS, Android, macOS, Windows, web.
If you want to put a to-do list on your TV, you could build a TV OS.
You could do that now. So who knows? It's limitless.
You're definitely going to have the most success if you stay in JavaScript, though.
Correct.
That's definitely one of the biggest caveats that we found going through this process is in terms of native support, there's not nearly as many options for Windows and macOS. A lot of the libraries that you're probably familiar with, Windows and macOS are definitely not first-class citizens and may not be supported at all.
Totally. I found on the website reactnative.directory, if you filter by macOS, there's 16 supported third-party libraries, which is very small. Right. I mean, I could only imagine how many there are for iOS and Android.
Right, exactly. And there are more for Windows.
About 43.
Most likely because of the Microsoft involvement.
Correct.
But I mean, even packages in that list that are supported, you're going to have a harder time finding examples and people to answer questions and documentation.
And it's a slower cycle, which is why I guess they're still on an older version of React Native because, once a third-party library supports it, the React Native Windows, React Native macOS project has to go through their implementation of it. So like you mentioned, the C++ conversion and making sure that it's actually digging in. And there's some stuff that, you might not have the functionality on a Mac, but you might have on a Windows. And that's where the platform.os will come in handy. So you can restrict certain aspects of the app. So I'm getting a little bit deeper. Like let's say you're using something with the compass. I don't think Windows machines have compasses these days. So, that would be something you would have to limit based on your platform.
Yeah, definitely. I think using React Native to build a macOS app or a Windows app, it's not something I would choose if you're not looking to have an app like a cross-platform experience. I might choose it if you're a JavaScript developer or a web developer who needs to make a desktop app and isn't familiar with the native technologies. This is an option to get something running very easily. But if you're trying to do something really complex that really integrates with the native sort of tool chains, I don't know if React Native would be the choice that I would make, but it's definitely pretty quick and easy way to get something running right away.
Totally. And this might be a perfect example of, how sometimes you might do, let's say, index.android.js, and you have your Android-specific code in that file. There's obviously setup around that. But this might be a certain scenario where you have your .windows.js set up too, or .macOS, so that you limit it. Maybe that's your navigator, right? If you're on a macOS or Windows, you're only displaying the one screen you want available on there.
Yeah.
I think there might be some issues too with like your packages and installation of all those because they might not be compatible. Certainly that's something with a little bit of time you could get it running and working.
Yeah, for sure. You may, if you do have experience with like building the native versions or like working with Windows apps or Mac OS apps, you'll probably have a little bit easier time since you'll probably have to do some customization on the native layer. And so if you're familiar with those technologies already, you'll probably have an easier time.
One thing I realized when I did the Mac OS, actually, you just reminded me, is the Mac OS folder looked just like an iOS folder. So if you're used to going, opening up your X project folder file in Xcode, you have pretty much everything the same as you would on iOS. So you could dig into there and build whatever it is. Obviously, the functions are different because it's a Mac and not an iOS, and the API is different in that sense.
But Apple is Apple.
Exactly. Yes. You're still Objective-C Swift on that layer end at the end of the day. So
cool. I think that's pretty much the gist of it for today. If you'd like to nerd out a little bit more about React Native, of course, feel free to check out Jamon's Twitch stream at rn.live. We just redid the website, rn.live website. You should definitely take a look. Our designer, Jenna, designed a whole beautiful landing page.
Did a really good job.
Complete with a sweet chat animation, worth the price of admission, just to go see that. You can also go directly to youtube.infinite.red. You can join our Slack community.infinite.red. And also check out our new Twitter community, which I'm not a part of because Twitter hates me. But that's at I don't know. Maybe now that Elon owns it.
Yeah.
I'll appeal directly to him. But you can find that at rntwitter.infinite.red. And Mazen, where can people find you on Twitter?
At Mazen Chami.
Of course, I'm at Robin_Hines with an E at the end. And you can find React Native Radio at React Native RDIO. As always, thanks to our producer and editor, Todd Worth, our assistant editor and episode release coordinator, Jed Bartofsky, our designer, Justin Husky, and our guest coordinator, Derek Greenberg. Thanks to our sponsor, Infinite Red. Check us out at infinite.red/React Native. And a special thanks to all of you for listening. Make sure you have subscribed on your favorite podcasting platform. A reminder that Infinite Red is hiring, so check out careers.infinite.red, and we'll see you all next time.